Tonight we revisit one case that fixed itself so firmly into the memory of 18th century London that the law, the press, and the anatomists all took their portion of it, and none of them let it go. One household in a narrow court off Fetter Lane, one girl bound by indenture to serve in it, one body carried out of it in August of 1767. One name, one indictment, one skeleton mounted in a niche for public viewing that entered the national record and has remained there. The case of Elizabeth Brownrigg begins in the City of London in the middle years of the reign of George III, in the parish of St Dunstan in the west, and the neighbouring precinct of Whitefriars, in the period between 1765 and 1767. London in those years was the largest city in Europe and, by most estimates the surviving figures allow, contained something in the order of 700,000 people. It was a city that had not yet been rebuilt by the Victorians and had not yet been surveyed by them either, and it must be understood as a place of very small units, courts, alleys, yards, rents and closes, packed tightly behind the principal thoroughfares and reached through covered passages barely wide enough for two people to pass. Fleet Street ran east from Temple Bar toward Ludgate Hill and the west front of St Paul's, and it was, in 1767, a street of printers, booksellers, engravers, taverns and shopkeepers, one of the busiest commercial arteries in the kingdom. It carried the coaches, the carts, the chairmen, the water carriers, and the endless foot traffic of a city that conducted its business in the open air. It was noisy in a way that is difficult now to reconstruct. Behind Fleet Street to the north ran Fetter Lane, a long and comparatively narrow street connecting Fleet Street to Holborn. It was not a fashionable address, and had not been one for some time. It was a street of trades. Off Fetter Lane, in the manner of the period, opened a series of small courts, each a cul-de-sac of houses built around a paved or partially paved yard, each entered through an archway or a passage from the lane. One of these was called Flower de Luce Court, a corruption of Fleur de Lis, and it is given in the records also as Fleur de Luce Court and Flower de Luce Court. The spelling is not consistent across the surviving documents, and the variation should be noted because it is characteristic of the period, and characteristic of the difficulties that attend the reconstruction of any street-level detail from these decades. The houses in such courts were narrow-fronted and deep, of brick, typically of 3 or 4 stories, with a garret above and a cellar below. The cellar is important, and it will return. These were not the houses of the poor. They were the houses of the middling sort, of tradesmen who employed apprentices, kept servants, owned their tools, paid their rates, and were known in the parish. A plumber, a house painter, a glazier, a plasterer. These were men of some substance in their small world, men whose names appeared on parish lists and whose good opinion carried weight with the overseers. The court would have been paved in stone, drained badly and shared by perhaps 8 or 10 households who knew a great deal about one another's business simply by proximity, because the windows of one house looked directly into the yard of the next, and the yards themselves were small enough that a raised voice would carry. This is the physical fact that the case ultimately turns upon. The houses were close. The parish authorities of St Dunstan in the west and the precinct of Whitefriars administered this district under the old poor law, and their administration extended to the disposal of children. A parish that maintained a workhouse maintained also a population of children, orphaned, abandoned, or surrendered by parents who could not support them. And the parish had a legal and financial interest in placing those children out as apprentices as soon as they were of an age to be bound. To bind a child apprentice was to transfer the cost of that child from the parish rate to a private household. The master received the child's labour, the parish received relief from the burden, The child received, in principle, maintenance instruction in a trade and a settlement. To the northwest of this district, in Lamb's Conduit Fields on the edge of the built city, stood the Foundling Hospital, established by charter under the persistence of Thomas Coram, and opened in the 1740s. By the 1760s, it too had a population of children reaching working age, and it too placed them out as apprentices. The hospital kept records, appointed inspectors, and considered itself, with reason, a more careful guardian than a parish vestry. It is one of the documented facts of this case that the hospital had, before 1767, received a complaint and acted upon it insufficiently. That will be set out in its place. At the western end of the Oxford Road, some 2 miles from Fetter Lane, stood the permanent gallows at Tyburn. Between Fetter Lane and Tyburn lay Newgate, the sessions house of the Old Bailey, and, adjoining the Old Bailey, the hall the Company of Surgeons had built for itself in 1751, sited there deliberately because the Murder Act of that same year had given the surgeons a legal claim upon the bodies of executed murderers, and the shorter the journey from the scaffold, the better. Every institution that would take a part in this case stood within a few minutes' walk of every other. The house in Flower de Luce Court had a kitchen at the back, with a beam across the ceiling, and a water pipe running beneath the beam, and from some point in the spring of 1767, a hook fixed into that beam. The hook had been put up for a purpose. The purpose is documented. The victim in this matter is Mary Clifford. She was a child of the London poor, and the record of her early life is thin in the way that the records of such children are almost always thin. Certain secondary accounts give her birth as 1751 and a baptism at St Dunstan in the West in the March of that year, which would make her 16 at her death. Other accounts, including contemporary ones, describe her as 14 when she entered the Brownrigg household, and as 17 at the time she died. These figures cannot all be correct, and the discrepancy is not resolved by any primary source recovered. What can be said with confidence is that she was a girl in her middle teens, that she was not an adult in law or in body, and that the exact year of her birth is not established beyond dispute. Where the sources disagree, the disagreement is itself part of the record, and it is not the business of this account to choose the version that reads most smoothly. Her father is named in the accounts as a shoemaker. Her mother died. Her father remarried to a woman also named Mary Clifford, and the children of the first marriage were, in consequence of straitened circumstances rather than indifference, given over to the care of the parish. This is the ordinary machinery of 18th century poverty, and it is worth stating plainly that being handed to the parish was not, in itself, a mark of abandonment. It was frequently the act of a family attempting to keep its children alive. The stepmother did not disappear from the girl's life. She will return, and her persistence is the reason this case exists in the record at all. On the 18th day of February 1766, according to the accounts that give a date, Mary Clifford was bound apprentice to James Brownrigg of Flower de Luce Court, house painter and plumber, by the overseers of the precinct of Whitefriars. She was to serve in his household, and in practice she was to serve his wife. She was, at the time of her binding, something in the region of 14 years of age. The indenture was a legal instrument of great weight. It bound the child to the master for a term of years. It gave the master the right of correction, and it must be stated because it bears directly upon the trial that followed, that the moderate corporal correction of an apprentice by a master was lawful in England in 1767 and was widely practised. The line between lawful correction and unlawful violence was not drawn by statute with any precision. It was drawn in the end by juries. The apprentice could not leave. To leave was to abscond, and an absconding apprentice could be pursued, returned, and punished. The child had no money, no settlement elsewhere, no family able to receive her, and no practical means of appeal beyond the overseers who had placed her. She was not the first girl placed in that house. Mary Jones had been taken from the Foundling Hospital. Mary Mitchell had been taken from Whitefriars. Both had been used well during the month on liking, the customary trial period, at the end of which either party might withdraw. And both, the record establishes, began to be beaten once the binding was complete, and withdrawal was no longer possible. The pattern is documented in the testimony of the survivor, and it is a pattern. Kindness during the period in which the child might still be taken back, and violence afterward. Whether that sequence reflected calculation or merely the removal of restraint is not established by any source recovered, and this account will not pretend to know. Mary Jones escaped. She had observed that the key was left in the street door overnight, and one morning she opened it and went out, and she found her way across the city to the Foundling Hospital and was admitted. She was examined there by a surgeon who found her body marked with bruises and sores. The hospital's governors instructed their solicitor, named in the Newgate calendar tradition as Mr. Plumtree, to write to James Brownrigg threatening prosecution unless the injuries were explained. No satisfactory answer was returned. The hospital, judging an action at common law imprudent, took the matter no further than the discharge of the girl from her indenture. That is the whole of the institutional response, and it is entered in the record without gloss. The hospital had been told. The hospital did not stop the household from receiving further children. Mary Mitchell also attempted to leave. She got out of the house and into the street and was seen there by one of the Brownrigg sons, who brought her back. She testified afterward that she was used with greater severity for having gone. Of Mary Clifford's own interior life we have almost nothing. She is known to history through the mouths of others, through the testimony of Mary Mitchell, who lived beside her in that house and slept where she slept, through the evidence of neighbours, overseers, a workhouse apothecary, and a hospital surgeon, through the description given by her stepmother in the witness box, and through the wounds recorded upon her body. Every physical description of her that survives is a description of her injuries. There is no portrait. There is no letter in her hand, though it is said that she had written to her stepmother during the first year and that the letters stopped. The record offers nothing of her early life beyond her name, her father's trade, her parish, and the date she was bound. She existed for 16 years or thereabouts, and she is preserved in the archive almost entirely as an account of the last months of that existence, set down by other people for the purpose of hanging somebody. She entered the house in Flower de Luce Court in the winter of 1766. The month on liking passed. The indenture was completed. She did not go out again. If you find value in stories preserved this way, consider liking the video and subscribing to the channel, and let me know in the comments where you are listening from. Now, back to the record. Elizabeth Brownrigg was born on the best information available about the year 1720. Her maiden name is given in some accounts as Hartley or Harkley. This is not confirmed in the sources recovered and should be treated as uncertain. She came of a working family. As a young woman, she married James Brownrigg, then an apprentice plumber, and the marriage lasted the whole of her life. The couple lived for some years in Greenwich, where the husband established his trade, before removing into the city. By 1765 they were settled at Flower de Luce Court, off Fetter Lane, in a house of the size and character already described. She bore 16 children, 3 survived to adulthood. That ratio is not remarkable for London in that century, and it is recorded here not as explanation. The record supplies no explanation, and this account will not manufacture one. But because it is a documented fact about her, and because the coroner's jury, the trial jury, and the pamphleteers all knew it, it formed, in the public mind of 1767, part of the arithmetic of the case, that a woman who had buried 13 children and delivered a great many others was the woman found to have beaten a child to death. The Newgate calendar makes precisely that observation, and does so at some length. Her husband prospered. He is described in the sources variously as a plumber, a house painter, and a plasterer, and he was probably all three, since the trades overlapped in practice. He employed apprentices of his own, one of whom, George Benham, will give evidence in this account. The household was solvent. It was not a household under economic pressure of any obvious kind, and the pamphlet literature of the day was careful to say so, being anxious to deny the crime any excuse from want. Elizabeth Brownrigg practised midwifery. She practised it well enough, and was regarded well enough, that in or about 1765, the overseers of St Dunstan in the West appointed her to attend the poor women of the parish workhouse. This is the pivot of the entire matter, and it should be stated slowly. She was given a public trust. She was placed by the parish in a position of authority over the most defenceless women in that parish, and she discharged that duty by every contemporary account, with competence and with what witnesses described as kindness. The same appointment made her a person of standing with the overseers, and it was through her standing with the overseers, and through the Foundling Hospital's willingness to place children with a respectable, married householder of good report, that girls came to be delivered into her house. The authority that gave her access to Mary Clifford was authority conferred by the parish itself. Her son John was of an age to work in the family trade and lived in the house. Her husband lived in the house. Both were present at various times for what took place in the kitchen. Both would be indicted. As to motive, the record does not supply one, and no confession recovered supplies one. There is no documented dispute, no theft of consequence, no accusation of misconduct that would explain the escalation. Elizabeth Brownrigg's own defence at trial characterised her actions as correction for idleness and for stealing food. The evidence established that the food in question was bread, and that the girl took it because she was not given enough to eat. Beyond that, the surviving material offers nothing but the sequence itself, and the sequence must be allowed to stand without a psychological narrative fastened to it. To supply a motive here would be to invent, and the record is silent. Mary Clifford's final months are reconstructed almost entirely from the sworn evidence of Mary Mitchell, who was in the house throughout, and from the physical evidence recovered from the premises. Where Mitchell's account is uncorroborated, it is identified as such below. She was, at the time she gave it, about 16 years old. She was cross-examined by both of the Brownriggs in person, and the court found her credible. The practice, as reconstructed through the proceedings, was as follows. The girls slept where they were told to sleep, on boards in the parlour, sometimes in the passage, and frequently in the cellar, which was unlit, and which was also used for coals. They were commonly locked in at night. Mary Clifford was fed insufficiently. At some point, roughly a year before her death, she broke open a cupboard in search of food, and was discovered. For this she was stripped and beaten, and thereafter kept in the cellar at night without bedding. On another occasion, having attempted to reach food and drink and broken down some boarding in the process, she was chained by the neck to a door. A jack chain was afterward recovered from the house and produced in court. The beatings were administered in the kitchen. In the earlier period, Mitchell testified, Elizabeth Brownrigg tied the girl by the hands to the water pipe that crossed the kitchen ceiling, with her arms drawn up above her head, the pipe being fixed to the beam by hooks. The girl was stripped for these beatings. The implements are named in the evidence: a horsewhip, a walking cane, a hearth broom, given in the testimony as an earth brush, and, on at least one occasion by the son, a leather belt. Mitchell stated that her mistress seldom left off until she had drawn blood. At some point in the spring of 1767, a hook was fixed into the kitchen beam. It was put there on the evidence for this use, and thereafter Mary Clifford was tied to the hook and whipped, and this occurred, according to Mitchell, at intervals of about a week. The medical consequence of that schedule is the material fact of this case, and it must be understood clearly, because it is what the surgeon's evidence turned upon. The wounds were not permitted to heal. Each beating reopened the surface of the last. By June of 1767, both girls carried infected, ulcerating sores across the back and shoulders that could not close. Mary Mitchell's own condition was such that when the parish authorities eventually had her undressed, her leather bodice had adhered to the raw flesh of her back and had to be pulled away, and she cried out when it was done. That detail is entered in the record by the officers who were present. It is not embellishment. It is a report of what happened when they took the clothing off a living girl. In the last weeks, Elizabeth Brownrigg was absent from the house for about a week. During that absence, the girls were not beaten, and their wounds began to scab over. On her return, she accused Mary Clifford of having done no work in her absence. On the Friday morning, she tied her to the hook in the kitchen and beat her again in further sessions through that day, and the girl was left without clothing through the day and through the night that followed. Mary Clifford was seen alive by her fellow apprentice, and by the men of the household, and by nobody else outside the walls of that house. The concealment that followed was domestic and improvised. When inquiry came to the door, the girl was denied. It was said that there was no such apprentice in the house. It was said, when pressed, that she was in the country, and when officers came in with the intention of searching, she was put into a cupboard, and the cupboard was shut. The house had a yard, and the yard was overlooked, and it was because the yard was overlooked that the matter came out at all. The proceeding that ended in Newgate began with a stepmother who would not accept an answer. On the 12th of July, 1767, Mary Clifford the elder came to Flower de Luce Court to see her stepdaughter. She was refused at the door. The servant who refused her had been instructed to refuse her and to deny that the girl was in the house. The instruction is documented in the evidence of George Benham, apprentice to James Brownrigg, who testified that Elizabeth Brownrigg had told him and Mary Mitchell that if the girl's stepmother came asking, she was not to be let in, the reason given being that the woman was of bad character and would teach the girl bad things. The stepmother did not accept it. She consulted her husband. She then went to the neighbour whose house adjoined the Brownriggs, a Mr. Deacon, and persuaded him to have one of his own servants watch the Brownriggs' yard. That servant was William Clipson. The window from which he watched looked down into the yard next door. It is recorded in one line of the evidence that the Deacon household had cause to keep a window open onto that yard, on account of a hog kept there, and that the cries from the neighbouring house had been heard. On Monday, the 3rd of August, 1767, Clipson saw in the yard below a girl who had been badly beaten and who appeared to be starved. He reported it. The report went to Mr. William Grundy, overseer of St. Dunstan's, who went to the house in company with Mr. John Elsdale, overseer of the precinct of Whitefriars, the precinct that had bound Mary Clifford in the first place, and which therefore retained an interest in her. There was an altercation at the door. James Brownrigg resisted. He asserted that the girl was not there or was in the country. Under pressure he produced a girl, but the girl produced was Mary Mitchell, and Clipson, on being brought to look at her, could not say she was the girl he had seen in the yard, or rather could say only that this was not the whole of it. Grundy demanded to know where Mary Clifford was. He was threatened with an action at law. He ordered the house searched. Mary Clifford was found locked in a cupboard. Her stepmother's description of her condition, given afterward in evidence, is the closest thing the record contains to a portrait of her. A face swollen out of its proportions, a mouth so swollen that it could not be closed, cuts beneath the throat consistent with a cane, a body and shoulders that were a single continuous sore, 2 scraps of rag laid upon them, and no power of speech. Both girls were removed to the parish workhouse infirmary. There the apothecary or attending medical man, named in the record as William Denbigh, examined Mary Clifford and described a body sawed from the soles of the feet to the crown of the head, with scars that appeared to have been made with an instrument upon the trunk, the legs and the thighs, and one wound upon the hip large enough to cover half the palm of his hand. James Brownrigg was carried before an alderman. The Newgate calendar names Alderman Crosby, and committed. Elizabeth Brownrigg and her son John were not taken. They left the house and did not return to it. On the 5th of August, Mary Clifford was transferred from the workhouse to St. Bartholomew's Hospital, then as now standing at Smithfield, a short distance from the Old Bailey. She was seen there on the 6th by the surgeon named in the record as Mr. Young. She died on the 9th of August, 1767. A coroner's inquest was summoned. The inquest returned a verdict of wilful murder against James Brownrigg, against Elizabeth Brownrigg, and against John Brownrigg. That verdict converted a parish complaint into a capital charge, and warrants were issued for the 2 who had fled. The pursuit that followed was not detective work. It was publicity. Descriptions of the wanted persons were placed in the London newspapers, and it was the newspapers that took them. Elizabeth and John Brownrigg moved about London, changing lodgings. They bought second-hand clothing at Rag Fair in the east of the city in order to alter their appearance, and they crossed the river and went out to Wandsworth, then a village well beyond the built edge of London on the Surrey bank. There they took lodgings in the house of a Mr. Dunbar, who kept a chandler's shop. A chandler in that period sold candles, groceries, small necessities, and newspapers. On the 15th of August, Dunbar read one of the advertisements describing the fugitives. The description matched the 2 people lodging under his roof. He fetched a constable. Mother and son were taken without resistance and conveyed back across the river to Newgate. The record does not establish what name, if any, the pair had given at the lodging. It establishes only that the disguise consisted of purchased clothes, that it did not survive contact with a printed description, and that the man who identified them did so because his trade required him to read the papers. The medical case against Elizabeth Brownrigg was assembled from 2 examinations conducted 6 days apart, and from the observations of the officers who first saw the girl alive. The first was made at the workhouse infirmary on the 3rd of August, 1767, by William Denbigh, who received Mary Clifford directly from the house in Flower de Luce Court. His description has already been set out. Sores from the feet to the head, essentially continuous over the back and shoulders, scarring consistent with an instrument applied to the body, the legs and the thighs, a single large wound at the hip, and swelling about the face, the mouth, and the neck. The second was made at St. Bartholomew's Hospital on the 6th of August by the surgeon Mr. Young, who attended her there in the 3 days before she died, and who gave evidence at the trial. His testimony, as it was entered in the official record, identified distinct wounds to the head, 6 of them by the account of one summary, extensive marks upon the body, consistent with the lash of a whip, and swelling about the neck which he associated with constriction. He gave it as his opinion that death proceeded from the accumulated injuries and from the condition into which the girl had been reduced by them, that is, from the wounds themselves and from the infection which the wounds, denied any interval in which to close, had established in the body. That is the essential medical finding, and it is worth stating in plain terms what kind of finding it is. There was no single blow identified as the killing blow. There could not be. Mary Clifford did not die of a wound. She died of the sum of them and of what they became. The prosecution, therefore, did not need to prove a fatal act. It needed to prove a course of conduct and to prove that death followed from it. This is why the evidence of the household, the hook, the whip, the cane, the chain, the schedule of weekly beatings, was not background to the medical case. It was the medical case. The defence attacked the neck. Elizabeth Brownrigg's own account, given in court, was that the swelling of the face and neck had been caused by the fall of a saucepan, its handle striking the girl in the neck, and she asserted that she had afterward poulticed the neck 3 times, bathed the place, and applied plaisters to the shoulders. She did not deny that she had lashed the girl. She denied only that she had intended to kill her. Mr. Young, examined upon that point, disputed that the injury to the neck could have been produced by the handle of a saucepan. Certain limitations upon the medical evidence should be entered honestly. This was 1767. There was no photography, no microscopy of the sort that would later be brought to such questions, and no forensic pathology as the term is now understood. The findings were the findings of naked eye examination by a surgeon and an apothecary, recorded in narrative form. Identification of the body was not at issue. The girl was known, she was named, she was seen alive by the officers who removed her, and she died in a hospital under her own name. So the case did not depend, as later cases would, on the inferential reconstruction of an identity from remains. What the medical evidence had to establish was causation across a period of months, and it established it by description rather than by measurement. The physical objects supplied the corroboration that the medicine could not. The whips were recovered, the canes were recovered, the jack chain was recovered, the hook was recovered from the beam in the kitchen, and it was produced in court. And it was produced in court because of an instruction the accused's husband had given, and which had not been carried out. George Benham testified that he had visited James Brownrigg in the Compter after the arrest, and that James Brownrigg had told him to go to the house, take the hook down from the beam, and burn all the sticks in it. He did not do it. The hook went to the Old Bailey. The trial took place at the Sessions House in the Old Bailey, before the court that would in time be formally styled the Central Criminal Court, at the September sessions of 1767. The date requires a note because the sources are not in agreement, and where the sources are not in agreement, this account will say so rather than choose. The proceedings of the Old Bailey record the sessions as commencing on the 9th of September, 1767, and the trial of James Elizabeth and John Brownrigg is filed under that date. Several detailed secondary accounts give the 7th of September as the day the case was heard. The Dictionary of National Biography, in its notice of Elizabeth Brownrigg, gives the 12th. The dates of sentence and execution, Friday the 11th and Monday the 14th, are firm and consistent across the accounts, and the discrepancy therefore concerns only the opening day of a trial that plainly occupied part of that week. The identity of the presiding judge is subject to the same difficulty. The Dictionary of National Biography names Mr. Justice Hewitt, James Hewitt, later Lord Lifford and Lord Chancellor of Ireland, as the judge before whom she was tried. Other accounts name Sir Robert Kite, who was Lord Mayor of London in that mayoral year, and who in that capacity sat upon the bench at the Old Bailey. Both statements may be true simultaneously, since the Lord Mayor, the Recorder, and one or more of the King's judges commonly sat together in that court. The record as recovered does not permit a single name to be given with certainty, and none is given here. The trial occupied 11 hours. That is a very long sitting by the standards of the Old Bailey in 1767, where felony trials were frequently disposed of in a matter of minutes, and where a defendant of Elizabeth Brownrigg's class might expect little formal assistance. The length is itself evidence of the seriousness with which the court treated the matter, and of the volume of testimony taken. The public interest was extreme. The case had been in the newspapers since the inquest. The advertisements had made the family's flight a matter of common knowledge, and the pamphlet trade was already preparing to profit from it. The evidence was presented in bodies, and it may be set out as the court received it. First, the discovery. The overseers, Grundy and Elsdale, established the visit to the house, the resistance at the door, the denial that the girl was there, the search and the finding of Mary Clifford locked in the cupboard. William Clipson established what he had seen from the window in the neighbouring house. The stepmother established her exclusion in July and the condition of the girl, when at last she saw her in August. Second, the domestic history. Mary Mitchell gave the account already set out. The month on liking, the beginning of the violence upon completion of the indenture, the water pipe, the hook, the stripping, the horsewhip, the cane, the hearth broom, the leather belt, the cellar, the chain upon the neck, the withholding of food, the final week of beatings after her mistress's return. She stated that she and Mary Clifford were, in effect, kept prisoners in the house. She was cross-examined by both Elizabeth and James Brownrigg in person, and she did not depart from her account. George Benham, apprentice to James Brownrigg, corroborated her upon the substance and added the instruction he had received in the Compter concerning the hook and the sticks. Third, the medical testimony. William Denbigh described the body he received at the workhouse. Mr. Young described the body he received at St. Bartholomew's, the wounds and the cause of death, and rejected the saucepan. Fourth, the conduct of the accused, the exclusion of the stepmother, the instruction to the servants to deny that the girl was in the house, the statement that she was in the country, the concealment in the cupboard, the flight, the purchase of clothes at Rag Fair, the lodging taken in Wandsworth under an assumed appearance, the instruction to destroy the hook and burn the sticks. The defence was, in substance, that this was correction and not murder. It conceded lashing. It relied upon the lawfulness of a master's right of correction, upon the absence of any design to kill, upon the saucepan as the innocent cause of the injuries to the neck, and upon the treatment the accused said she had given the girl afterward. The poultices, the bathing, the plaisters, Character witnesses were produced, and they spoke, presumably, to the reputation Elizabeth Brownrigg had held in the parish as a midwife. It did not succeed, and the reasons it did not succeed are visible in the structure of the evidence. The right of correction was a right of moderate correction, and the jury was shown a hook fixed into a beam for the purpose of suspending a naked child, and a chain and a whip that was used until blood came, at intervals of a week, over a period of months, upon a body that was never permitted to heal. The saucepan could not be reconciled with the surgeon's evidence, and the conduct after the fact, the denials, the concealment in the cupboard, the flight in bought clothes, the instruction to destroy the hook, was placed before the jury as the conduct of a person who understood perfectly well what she had done. Elizabeth Brownrigg was found guilty of the wilful murder of Mary Clifford. James Brownrigg and John Brownrigg were acquitted of the murder. They were detained upon a separate indictment for the assault and abuse of Mary Mitchell. They were convicted upon it, and they were each sentenced to 6 months' imprisonment and a fine of 1 shilling. Sentence upon Elizabeth Brownrigg was pronounced on Friday the 11th of September, 1767. The court, in accordance with the ordinary practice in capital cases of murder, sentenced her to be returned to the prison from which she came, to be taken thence on Monday the 14th of September to the usual place of execution, and there to be hanged by the neck until she was dead, and her body afterward to be dissected and anatomized, according to the statute. The statute was the Murder Act, 25 George II, Chapter 37, passed in 1751 and in force from 1752. It provided that the body of a person executed for murder should not be buried, but should be either dissected or hung in chains, and it was framed expressly to add a further terror to the sentence of death. The court had no discretion in the matter. The Sunday interval was likewise ordinary. Murderers were commonly sentenced on a Friday so that they might have a Sunday before execution. Elizabeth Brownrigg was returned to Newgate and placed in the condemned hold in irons and upon a diet of bread and water, which was the ordinary treatment of the condemned in that prison in that period. The Ordinary of Newgate, the prison chaplain, whose office carried both the spiritual care of the condemned and the lucrative right to publish an account of them afterward, is named in the record as the Reverend Joseph Moore. It is reported that over the weekend Elizabeth Brownrigg acknowledged to him the truth of the evidence given against her, and that she prayed, and that she asked for mercy in terms consistent with the religious formulae of the period. Here a caution must be entered. The Ordinary's account was a commercial publication. It was written by a man with an institutional interest in the penitence of his subjects, and a commercial interest in the sale of their last words. Accounts of the demeanour and the confessions of the condemned, when they proceed from prison officials in this period, are not always reliable in their particulars, and they should be read with that knowledge. The fact of a confession in this case is corroborated by more than the ordinary, and may be taken as established. The wording attributed to her cannot be relied upon to the same degree. On the morning of Monday the 14th of September 1767, her husband and her son, themselves in custody, were permitted to see her in the press yard at Newgate. The three prayed together. The irons were struck off by the prison blacksmith. Her hands and arms were bound with cord, and the rope she was to hang by was placed about her neck in the yard, in the usual manner, before she was put into the cart. The execution was public. It was carried out at Tyburn, at the western end of the Oxford Road, which had served as the principal place of execution for London and Middlesex for centuries, and would continue to do so until the executions were removed to Newgate in 1783. Executions in England would not be conducted within prison walls out of public view until the passing of the Capital Punishment Amendment Act of 1868, a full century after this case. What took place on the 14th of September 1767 was therefore an entirely conventional public execution of the period, a cart procession of some 2 miles through the streets, before an assembled crowd, at a fixed and advertised time. The executioner was Thomas Turles, who held the office of common hangman for London and Middlesex in that period. He rode in the cart with her. The crowd is the one respect in which the day departed from the ordinary. Tyburn crowds were frequently in sympathy with the condemned. The theatre of the scaffold customarily allowed the dying a certain dignity, and the mob's hostility was as often reserved for the authorities as for the prisoner. It was not so on this occasion. The contemporary accounts, and the Newgate calendar after them, record a crowd that expressed its abhorrence without restraint, that called out that the devil would fetch her, and that prayed aloud not for her salvation, but for her damnation. The ordinary himself is reported afterward to have been distressed by the conduct of the spectators, and to have questioned whether such people could be called Christians. At the gallows she prayed with the ordinary. She asked him to tell the crowd that she confessed her guilt, and acknowledged the justice of her sentence. He did so. That confession, made at the place of execution and in the hearing of the assembled people, confirmed the substance of Mary Mitchell's testimony, that the beatings had been inflicted as described, and by her. She was turned off. The body was left hanging for approximately half an hour, which was the customary interval. She was not buried. Under the Murder Act, the body was placed into a hackney coach and carried to the Surgeons' Hall in the Old Bailey, where it was publicly exhibited on the 16th of September, and afterward dissected and anatomized. The bones were subsequently wired and mounted, and the skeleton of Elizabeth Brownrigg was placed in a niche in the hall, where it remained on view for many years. The stated purpose, as the Gentleman's Magazine put it, being that the enormity of her cruelty should make a more lasting impression upon those who saw it. With the execution of the sentence and the delivery of the body to the surgeons, the legal proceedings in the matter of Mary Clifford were concluded, and the file was closed. The case did not close with the file. It was reported in the newspapers throughout August and September of 1767. It was reported in the Gentleman's Magazine, whose volume for that year carries both an account and an engraved plate depicting the ill usage of the apprentices. It was reported in the pamphlet trade, which produced within weeks such publications as An Appeal to Humanity, in an account of the life and cruel actions of Elizabeth Brownrigg, printed for Harrison and Ward in 1767, and a genuine and authentic account of the life, trial and execution of Elizabeth Brownrigg, and others besides, several of which bound her story together with the older case of Elizabeth Branch and her daughter, hanged in Somerset in 1740 for beating their servant girl to death, the pamphleteers having grasped at once that they were dealing with a type and not an aberration. It passed from there into the Newgate calendar, and it is principally through the calendar that it survived. Knapp and Baldwin's new Newgate calendar gave it several pages. Celebrated Trials took it up in 1826. Wilson's Wonderful Characters took it up in 1822. 60 years after the execution, the calendar was still holding her up as an object of instruction, and its editors still could not account for her. That a midwife, a mother of 16, should wantonly kill the child of another woman was, they wrote, a thing to be explained only by the depravity of human nature. That is not an explanation. It is an admission that none was available. It remains, 2.5 centuries on, the honest position. She entered literature as a byword. The anti-Jacobin, in the 1790s, printed a set of verses in the form of an inscription for the door of her cell at Newgate, a parody aimed at Southey and at the fashion for sentimental sympathy with malefactors, in which the poet is made to lament the harshness of the laws that hanged a woman for whipping 2 apprentices to death. It is a savage joke, and it works only because every reader knew who she was. In September of 1832, Fraser's magazine printed an anonymous satire titled Elizabeth Brownrigg, a sustained attack on the criminal romantic novel of the day. Its authorship has been argued over ever since, with a persistent attribution to the young Thackeray that has never been settled. Her name, by then, had detached itself from the girl she killed and become a literary counter. The institutional consequence is real but modest, and it should not be overstated. The Foundling Hospital, which had been warned in the case of Mary Jones and had not acted decisively upon the warning, tightened its procedures for the placing and inspection of apprentices thereafter, and reported cases of abuse among its apprentices declined. The parish apprenticeship system as a whole was not reformed in 1767 and would not be substantially reformed for decades. The lawful right of a master to correct an apprentice was not abolished by this case. What the case did was to make visible, to a very large public, what that right could contain when the household in which it operated was closed, and the child inside it had nowhere to go. The neighbours heard. The hospital was told. The stepmother came to the door in July, and Mary Clifford was found in the cupboard on the 3rd of August. Of the physical remains, this: the girl was buried, and the location of her grave is not established in any primary source recovered. The woman who killed her was not buried, and her skeleton stood in a niche in the surgeon's hall in the Old Bailey, and was drawn and engraved, and shown to visitors, and passed in due course into the possession of the institution that became the Royal College of Surgeons. It is one of the durable and unlovely facts of this case that the body, which survives in the record, and which was preserved, catalogued, and displayed for the instruction of the public, is not the body of the victim, and that is the shape of the remembering. She appears as an occasion, not a person. The case is filed under the name of the woman who hanged for it. The pamphlets are titled with her name. The calendar entry is headed with her name. The satires are written about her name. The skeleton in the niche was labelled with her name. Mary Clifford, who was born to a shoemaker's family in the parish of St Dunstan in the west, who was given to the parish because her people could not feed her, who was bound at 14 to a household of good report in a court off Fetter Lane, and who died at St Bartholomew's Hospital on the 9th of August 1767, is preserved in the national record chiefly as a list of her injuries and as the reason a more famous person was executed. And it is a hard thing to set down, at the end of an account like this one, that the archive which has kept every detail of the hook and the whip and the chain and the crowd has kept almost nothing of her at all. The case of Mary Clifford was the single matter examined in this account. The conviction was entered. The execution was carried out in 1767. The case became part of the national record. It has not left